Turn the conference over to Chris Jonas. Please go ahead.
Good day, everyone. This is Chris Jonas, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Association for Business Economics. We're pleased to present today's webinar. Before we turn to the topic, I'd like to quickly draw your attention to a few upcoming NABE events, including the 36th Annual NABE Economic Policy Conference, which will be taking place February 23rd through 25th at the Capitol Hilton here in Washington, D.C. This year's conference is arranged around the theme 2020 Vision, Examining Policy Prescriptions in an Election Year. The Economic Policy Conference provides a forum for policymakers, business leaders, and economists to engage in candid and practical discussions on the challenges faced in fiscal, monetary, and regulatory policy arenas. Confirmed speakers include Richard Clarida, Loretta Mester, and David Malpass. Registration is now available at NABE.com for this event. Keep in mind the early bird deadline is approaching, and that will be Wednesday, January 29th. So register before January 29th to save $150 off the on-site rate. I also just wanted to mention NABE's continuing education program, the Certified Business Economist certification program. We have a number of courses in the first half of this year, beginning with weekly online courses on February 18th that cover economics of strategy and managerial decision-making, and business applications of statistics and data analytics. We'll also host a machine learning course for economists immediately following the policy conference in D.C. So stay tuned for more CBE updates. Also, the full CBE calendar can be found at the Education tab on NABE.com. We've also linked to that calendar on the webinar screen. Okay, and now on to the topic. Before we start, I just want to note that this podcast will be recorded, and the recording will be available on NABE.com under the Events tab later today. We will have a slide presentation during today's event. You can download the presenter slides in PDF format separately in the Links tab on your webinar screen. The webinar will include a question and answer period after the presentations. However, if you have a question, you can submit that question at any time during today's event. Just type your question into the box on the left side of the window and then click on Send. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's event. Jed Kolko is Chief Economist at Indeed, the world's #1 job site. He leads Indeed's research division, which is called the Hiring Lab. Jed, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for joining us today. As Chris mentioned, I am going to share some of my sense of what's going on in the labor market and what it might mean for the election. And there should be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. One thing I'll ask, I am going to be reading your questions as you type them in on the fly, so keep them clear and short, and that'll give me a better chance of answering them correctly. Let's get started on what's happening in the labor market, what it might mean for the election. Before I look at any data, it's worthwhile taking a step back and thinking about how the economy and elections tend to be related. People wonder about the effects in both directions, both how the economy affects elections and how elections affect the economy. Clearly, the economy affects elections to some extent. Plenty of research suggesting that both national and state economic conditions can affect how people vote. It's by no means the only factor. There was a lot of ongoing debate over economic anxiety in the 2016 vote. Lots of detailed research trying to parse out whether it was economic concerns or other kinds of social issues and other kinds of anxiety or uncertainties that really drove the 2016 vote. So the effect of the economy on an election can remain an unresolved question even years later. One thing we do know, and I'll show you data on this in a moment, is that the economy today ranks relatively low among voters' concerns. So given the relatively strong economy, people might be less likely to vote economic concerns than they have in the past. The flip side is the question of how elections affect the economy. Are there regular patterns in election years in how the economy or the labor market behave? My sense of the research is there are offsetting effects of elections on the economy. On the downside, upcoming elections can create uncertainty, certainly around policy, which might depress investment in particular sectors. At the same time, the flip side, the positive effect, is that election years sometimes spur stimulus. We can sometimes see more fiscal stimulus in particular in an election year, and sometimes that can end up offsetting the effect of the uncertainty. Hard to say on balance. Much of the research finds no significant effect of election year on key economic indicators. One thing that is clear is that economic confidence is highly partisan. And so the process of an election and the outcome of an election could affect the economy through its effect on economic confidence, but economic confidence itself is highly partisan. Now we can see evidence of a few of these effects from some recent Gallup surveys. Few people rate the economy as their #1 concern, according to a Gallup survey last month. Only 11% of Americans mentioned economic issues as the nation's most important problem. That's down from around the 40s, around the 2016 election, and even higher than that during the recession. So right now, the share of Americans who rate the economy as their #1 concern is at its lowest point right now since Gallup started asking this question almost 20 years ago. The extent to which it's a concern, though, is highly partisan. In September, Gallup asked about views of the economy and reported by subgroup. You see that Republicans far more likely than Democrats to rate economic conditions as excellent or good and think the economy is getting better. Democrats dramatically more likely than Republicans to think recession is likely within 1 year. Now these differences between parties are much bigger than the differences in the actual economic conditions that Democrats and Republicans are experiencing, either in their own household or in their local economies. And later on during this webinar, we'll look at some fresh off the presses data on what's happening for likely Democrats and likely Republicans in the labor market. So that gives you a bit of a background about how the economy and the election are likely to affect each other. Let's start with what's actually happening in the labor market with some good news and bad news. Now, rather than going through a whole overview of what's happening in the labor market, I want to highlight just 2 charts that are at the moment my 2 favorite ways to understand what's going on in the labor market right now. The first one is the good news chart, and that's what's happening to earnings, particularly in low-wage industries. What this chart is showing you is average hourly earnings year over year, each month up to November 2019, the latest that we just got in the monthly jobs report, broken out by 3 industry tiers. The blue line is low-wage industries, and that's where we've seen a dramatic increase in wage growth for most of the past 2 years. Wage growth has picked up as well for middle wage industries. It's been flatter for high wage industries. But this is good news for the people who are least well off in the labor market. This typically happens when the labor market gets tight. Tight labor markets tend to narrow various gaps in the labor market, particularly gaps in employment and earnings between those with, say, higher and lower education, or between different racial and ethnic groups. That's what we're seeing right now. This is probably not a trend that will outlast this point of the economic cycle, but it is a trend that is helping the least well off. The not so good news, though, comes from looking at what's happening to employment in goods-producing sectors. Now, in this graph, I'm showing year-over-year employment growth, bucketing employment into 2 different categories. The blue line is goods-producing sectors, manufacturing, construction, mining, and a few others, with the remainder of the economy outside of government, services. And services include both well-paid services serving businesses, professional technical consulting services, as well as the wide range of personal services including things like healthcare and education. What you see right away is how much more volatile employment in goods-producing sectors is, and it's also clear that that growth has slowed in the past year to the point where it is now below year-over-year employment growth in services industries, and a big change from the boom in manufacturing and other goods-producing employment in 2018. The goods versus services split in the labor market, in the economy, looks very different when we divide this by partisan lines, so when we divide it by geography. Places that tend to lean Republican have a higher share of goods-producing jobs in their economy. Red places tend to have a disproportionate share of mining, manufacturing, and some construction jobs. Blue-leaning places tend to have a disproportionately high share, especially of professional and technical business services, as well as certain kinds of personal services. What we're going to see as we look in the retail or what's happening in employment and unemployment in red and blue places will mimic to some extent what we're seeing when we look at goods versus services. We see it more clearly, goods versus services, than we do when we break down by places, because every place has a mix of goods employment and services employment. But keep this chart in mind when we start to look at what's happened to employment in red and blue places. And that's where we'll go next, to start to look at what has happened to labor markets in blue and red America. Now, when I show you some of these charts, when I define red places and blue places, whether that's states or counties, this is all based on how people voted in 2016. So a red state or red county is a place where more people voted for Trump than for Clinton in 2016. Blue states or blue counties are places where more people voted for Clinton than for Trump in 2016. Of course, voting patterns in 2020 might turn out to be different in important ways than they were in 2016. But for our measure of blue versus red, it's going to be based on 2016 vote. So the most precise way, geographically granularly precise way of looking at what's happened to the labor market rent in America is to look at what's happened at the county level. That is the smallest geographic level at which we get relatively recent employment data and have pretty comprehensive data on how people voted in 2016. So what you see actually is a muted mirror of the goods versus services chart that you saw before. The red counties, like employment in the goods producing sectors, increased, accelerated in 2018, and moved actually slightly ahead of job growth in blue counties for a period, and now it's fallen back behind growth in blue counties. Now, the gap was bigger in the previous administration. Under the last 2 years of the Obama administration, job growth in blue counties exceeded job growth in red counties by a larger amount than today. So the gap's not as wide today as it was, but we still now are seeing a return to having faster job growth in blue places after a period in 2018, again, during that boom in manufacturing, when job growth in red counties was ahead of job growth in blue counties. These data at the county level are only available up to the second quarter of 2019. These are QCEW data. These are the more detailed employment data, employment and wage data that the BLS collects. And they're the basis for the benchmark revision that will happen with next month's jobs report. So the monthly data will eventually catch up and get benchmarked to these lagged county data. But the state level are available from the same monthly jobs report data. And we can look all the way up to November 2019, comparing not only red states and blue states, but also calling out what's happened to job growth in battleground states. So the first thing you see is job growth has been fairly similar year over year in red states and blue states. Again, this is based on the 2016 vote. And here, red states and blue states exclude the 6 battleground states that are called out separately. You see here, blue states are a little bit behind red states, even though blue counties were ahead of red counties. There's actually a difference because there's been particularly strong growth, job growth recently, in the blue parts of red states. So think of big, booming Sunbelt metros in redder Sunbelt states. And that accounts for why red states are a bit ahead of blue states, but blue counties, as we saw on the previous slide, are a bit ahead of red counties. So going back to the state slide, what really stands out is when we look at the battleground states. Now, given U.S. elections are, in fact, a collection of state elections, with battleground states playing an outsized importance, what might matter more for the election is what's happening in the economy of battleground states. What this chart makes clear is that it's very hard to generalize about the labor markets of battleground states because they divide into 2 very different camps. There are the 3 Sunbelt battleground states, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, with job growth significantly faster than the U.S. as a whole, both in the past year and beyond. At the other extreme are the Great Lakes battleground states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, that in the past year have lagged the rest of the country in job growth and have lagged longer term. So again, very hard to generalize about what is happening in battleground states. And if one wants to look at these 6 battleground states, it's as important to look at the range of labor market outcomes in those states as it is to look at them together as a group. I expect this will continue to be a theme throughout the election year, and candidates who are trying to tailor their economic messaging to battleground states will need more than one message. There's as much heterogeneity in what's going on in the economies of the battleground states as there is in the U.S. labor market overall. So if we dig a little bit deeper and go back again to those county data that are a bit more lagged, this is county data back through 2019 Q2, we can actually take a closer look at these battleground states. And we see that the real laggards in terms of job growth in battleground states are not only within the Great Lakes battlegrounds rather than in the Sunbelt battlegrounds, but within the Great Lakes battlegrounds, the slow growth is in their red counties. So the more rural areas of the northeastern and midwestern states that flipped from Obama to Trump. And that's where we're really seeing slower growth and growth that has slowed down. These are areas that are more dependent on goods-producing sectors. They are many of these places are more exposed to trade and therefore to political uncertainty. These are areas that also get a disproportionate amount of attention in election campaigns. So it's the red counties in the Great Lakes battlegrounds, places that are often held out as places that best represent real America or harken back to a certain nostalgia for America's past. These are places that are lagging in terms of employment growth. So if we wanted to track one important set of places very closely, we'd want to keep a close eye on these red counties in the Great Lakes battlegrounds. Now, so far, everything I've shown you is looking at aggregates by place, red versus blue states, red versus blue counties. But of course, even within counties, there are both Democratic-leaning voters and Republican-leaning voters. They differ, they split by education, they split by race and ethnicity, by age. And so it's worthwhile taking an even closer look at the individual level and how people are faring in the labor market. And it's possible to do this with a model of how people voted in 2016 based on survey data at the individual level. So take self-reported voting in 2016, build a regression/classification tree model on their demographics and geographic characteristics, create a predicted support, who does every person in the CPS, whom would we predict them to have voted for in 2016, and then take the raw CPS metadata and calculate an estimate of the unemployment rate for people who probably would have supported Clinton in 2016 and the people who probably would have supported Trump in 2016. And we see that the unemployment rate has fallen over the past 3 years, both for likely Trump supporters, the red line, and likely Clinton supporters, the blue line. Recently, in the past month, in December, there was a dip down in the unemployment rate for Trump supporters, but more of the gains over the past year actually occurred to people who are likely to vote for Clinton in 2016. This is unemployment. Of course, unemployment is a limited measure. One thing that stands out when we start dividing up people based on a prediction of what their partisan leaning is that an unusually high share of likely Republican-leaning adults are out of the labor force. And so even though the unemployment rate is lower for likely Trump supporters, prime age EPOP, prime age employment population ratio, actually also is lower for likely Trump supporters. In the places that have suffered more joblessness, more people out of the labor market, tend to be more rural, tend to lean red. So when we look at a broader set of labor market indicators over the past year, we see that there is strong improvements both for likelier Trump supporters and likelier Clinton supporters based on how we predicted they would vote in 2016 on the unemployment rate, on U6, prime age EPOP, and median weekly earnings. Now, on all four of these measures, year over year, things have improved a bit more for alien voters, and more than a bit more in terms of median weekly earnings for likely the new voters. But I think the bigger point is that the recent changes in what's happened for likely Trump and likely Clinton supporters have been similar. That both blue and red America have seen significant improvements in the economy and in the labor market over the past many years. Slightly stronger in the past year for blue America, and there are bigger pockets of weakness in some red places, particularly those red counties in those Great Lakes battleground states, so the more rural parts of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. But for the most part, the labor market recovery of recent years has been a bipartisan affair. So that's what we see when we look at more recent short-term cyclical measures of how the labor market is doing. Cyclically, for the most part, blue and red America look fairly similar. But when we turn to longer-term divides, differences in red and blue labor markets that really shape whether people are anxious about the economy, what their concerns are, what their economic priorities are, and how candidates might message to people in those places, we start to get a very different picture. So while red and blue America look fairly similar, short-term cyclical measures, they look radically different on more fundamental and enduring measures. The best way to see this is by looking at a longer set of measures and seeing how much they correlate with how a county voted in 2016. So again, using a 2016 vote, And what this chart is showing you is the correlation at the metro level, metros being our best approximation of labor markets, between each measure listed in the chart and the 2016 Democratic margin, the margin by which the county voted for Clinton over Trump. If you did the correlation to the Republican margin, it would simply be the reverse. So negative 0.07 instead of 0.07. And this is all population weighted. So what you see right away is two of the measures that we've been looking at that are really cyclical measures, job growth year over year, the unemployment rate, those both are a bit more favorable. In other words, slightly positively correlated with the Democratic over Republican margin in 2016, but those correlations are really low, 0.02, 0.07. In contrast, when we look at more fundamental measures of local labor markets and local economies, things like prime age EPOP, home price growth, inequality, the cost of living, we get correlations that are dramatically stronger. A correlation of 0.76 between the cost of living, local cost of living, and whether a place, how strongly a metro voted for Clinton over Trump. The percent of jobs in non-routine occupations, routine occupations being those that are probably at greater risk from automation. So percent jobs in non-routine occupation is a proxy for how well positioned a local job market is to manage any job threats from automation. Percent of those with bachelor's degree, much higher education levels in Democratic places than in Republican places. Household income, much higher in Democratic places than Republican places. So really on all of these longer-term fundamental measures, the relationship with partisanship is quite strong, much, much stronger than either of the cyclical measures, job growth, recent job growth, unemployment, is with partisan measures. So even though the cyclical trends aren't especially partisan, these longer-term economic fundamentals are clearly much more partisan. It suggests that the kinds of concerns that are more prevalent in democratic-leaning areas would be things like the high cost of living, household inequality, both of which are strongly correlated with the Democratic vote margin, whereas the kinds of concerns, the economic concerns that probably matter more in Republican-leaning areas has to do with the quality of jobs, likely future job growth, home price growth, all of which look significantly worse in Republican local areas than in Democratic local areas. So this suggests a pretty different set of likely top economic concerns in Democratic areas than in Republican areas. Now, to give you another sense of this, rather than just as a correlation, we can look at the actual places where some of these factors are more or less prevalent. So taking this measure of percent of jobs in non-routine occupations, again, this is a proxy for how secure or well insulated a local job market might be in the face of automation. This percent of jobs in routine occupations, so the flip side, the share of jobs that are routine, tends to be highest in states toward the center of the country, in the Midwest and the South, Indiana, Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi. These are states where more than half of jobs are classified as routine jobs. These are jobs in manufacturing, mining, as well as service jobs that may be easier to automate, like administrative and clerical jobs. These are jobs, these routine jobs, are thought of as more risk of automation. The coasts are at lower job loss risk. the states that have a much smaller share of jobs that are in these so-called routine occupations tend to be clustered in the Northeast, in the Atlantic states around the DC area, and on the West Coast. And so you can see very clearly that even though a map of unemployment looks quite different in the U.S., in this, the map of routine jobs and where places might be more at risk from automation lines up pretty closely with a partisan map of America, where you've got much stronger Democratic support on the coast in the Northeast and on the West Coast, stronger Republican support in most of the rest of the country. One question is whether these differences are likely to change over time. I talk about these routine jobs and these other measures as measures that are more economic fundamentals. So we might not see over time much change in certain places being richer than others. A local job mix doesn't change that often over time. But there are ways in which the country, if anything, is pulling further apart on some of these economic measures that are correlated with partisanship. And I want to end by showing you two examples of that. The first is looking at earnings inequality across America. So this is a chart looking at the county level, what the spread is in earnings inequality, that's earnings per worker, looking at different percentile ratios. So looking first at the blue line, what that's showing you is the ratio over time between per worker earnings at the 90th percentile of counties, and this is all weighted by employment, versus the 10th percentile. Blue line suggests that there has been a modest long-term increase in geographic inequality, a growth of that 90-10 spread from the 90s until about 2015, and then it's eased back recently. And in the last year or so, it's pretty much back to where it's been since around 2000. So there's not been that much change in geographic inequality when we look at the 90th to the 10th percentile. Where we really see the increase in geographic inequality is when we look at the top, the 99th percentile of counties. And these are several counties in the Bay Area, Manhattan, other counties with the highest per worker earnings in the U.S. Comparing that very top to the median county, that's where we see the richest places really getting richer. Since 1991, a fairly dramatic increase in geographic inequality, with the top pulling away. At the moment, almost as high as where inequality was geographically at the end of the boom last decade, 2007, 2008, has eased off in the past couple of quarters, but only slightly. But clearly a trend that has been going upward since the early 90s and actually before. This is a trend that fairly closely follows the trend in national household income inequality. And that's a trend that's been on the rise since at least 1980. And the other way to see that we are moving in the direction of greater polarization across places in the U.S. Is by looking at different types of places and what the vote in the presidential elections have looked like over the past 5 elections. So what I'm showing you here, and this will be the last chart I showed before wrapping up, is the Republican margin in the presidential vote. So positive numbers mean more Republican votes over Democratic votes, negative numbers, Democrats won, and dividing counties into 6 types of places. The urban, the core, dense counties of large metros, then the higher density suburbs of large metros and the lower density suburbs of large metros, middle-sized metros, small metros, and non-metropolitan areas, which includes small towns and rural areas across America. Now, even back in 2000, there was a big geographic split in how people voted, with Republicans doing much better in non-metropolitan areas and small metros, and in the lower density suburbs of large metros, the exurbs, with Democrats doing better in the urban and high density suburbs of large counties. From 2000 to 2016, though, those differences have widened, with the Republican margin shrinking further in places they tend to lose, the large metros of urban counties and those higher density suburbs, but gaining share in places that have traditionally been more Republican, the small metros and non-metro areas, such that geography is becoming a better and better prediction over time of how a place is going to vote. Add this to the growing geographic inequality with places pulling apart more economically, and we might see that those economic fundamentals will end up being more and more tightly correlated with partisanship over time. That comes with a widening gap in the issues that are the top concerns of people in Democratic and Republican areas, and could make it harder for bipartisan policies to pass. And naturally, these increases in geographic inequality on a range of measures have raised lots of concerns and have pointed to some healthy policy directions, I think. With a focus on policies even among people who have not sort of engaged on geographic or regional questions in the past. And I think for these healthy policy directions, ways in which we can face regional gaps more head-on, are first, increasingly questioning location incentives, tax benefits, others incentives that local and state governments often give in order to attract or retain businesses. The Amazon HQ2 competition over the past couple of years brought a lot of these concerns about location incentives to the forefront, and so there's been a much louder debate about this in the past, than in the past. More recently, the Opportunity Zone program that offers a range of investment tax breaks to specified geographic areas has also raised healthy questions about whether to offer location-based incentives and how. I think a second policy direction is thinking about reducing barriers to geographic mobility. Housing constraints that make places with very strong job markets and well-paying jobs unaffordable for many is one barrier. Another kind of barrier is occupational licensing and other regulations that might prevent someone from practicing their craft, taking their trade to another state. I think a third is other kinds of proposals for investing in struggling places. Proposals like the Heartland visas. Others have called for greater investment in colleges and university branches in areas facing economic challenges are some good examples of that. And then some non-place-based strategies. There's been some thoughtful research that suggests that some of the increase in geographic inequality falls directly out as a corollary of increases in other, in broader forms of household and worker inequality. So here we're at the point of a healthy debate, looking at how to face head-on some of these who are regional inequalities that are adding to our growing geographic partisanship. So thanks for joining us today. Here are ways to keep up with our research and to stay in touch. What I'd like to do is turn to a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. Feel free to add any others that you have. And we will go for a few more minutes until we're off of questions. So one question that came in was, is it right to think of this partisan split in geographic inequality as rooted in fundamentals? And if I could, Chris, sorry, could I flip the slides back to answer one of these questions? I'd love to go back to the slide.
Yeah, let me give it back to you.
Great. So on this chart that showed that there's both higher median household income and a higher cost of living in democratic areas. A natural question is, well, what about cost of living adjusted incomes? Are incomes still higher at the household level than to adjust for cost of living? And the answer is yes, that cost of living adjusted household incomes are still higher in democratic areas. That happens to be not so much because wages adjusted for cost of living are higher in democratic areas. It's more than in democratic areas. The typical household is more likely to have people working and with less income coming from other sources. Republican areas tend on average to be older, more retirees, and so even if cost of living adjusted wages don't show as much of a gap between red and blue places, when we look at income from all sources and look across a whole household and take into account employment and those who are out of the labor market, then even adjusted for cost of living, median household incomes are still higher in Democratic-leaning areas. So Democratic voters are more likely to be in places with higher income and higher cost of living, but those higher incomes more than offset the higher cost of living in those areas. So another question that came in was, thinking overall, is the job market a net positive or net negative for Trump? Given how strong the job market has been, it is likely that on balance, the labor market at the moment is a positive, though at the same time, it is possible that a downturn in the labor market could create concerns about the economy that could end up cutting either way. So generally speaking, the labor market is strong for most people, including even at the bottom. A stronger economy and labor market in general helps the incumbent. But as we noted at the beginning, the economy ranks lower than it usually does in terms of voters' concerns. And there are some pockets, such as those red counties in the Great Lakes battleground states, where the economy is doing less well than it was than in other parts of the country. I'm going to pause here and thank everyone for their time. Happy to continue the conversation on Twitter and elsewhere. I'm going to turn it back to Chris if you want any closing thoughts.
Great, thanks, Jed. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today in the MAVE webinar. Today's program is copyright 2020 by the National Association for Business Economics with all rights reserved. This does conclude the event. Thank you again. You may now disconnect.
Today's call. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.